Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. Maurice Hirsch today from just outside Jerusalem, but we're bringing you our daily update on what's going on in the war on all of the different fronts. And today we'll be joined by our special guest, Advocate Anne Herzberg, the legal advisor for NGO Monitor, to discuss a very specific but very dangerous aspect of this war and its ongoing and the ongoing implications of the war. We'll start firstly with the update from the different fronts. We'll start with Gaza, where the IDF forces are continuing on with the operations to destroy the terrorist infrastructure, killing terrorists where necessary, taking the rest under arrest, and also destroying the financial and general terror infrastructure of the terrorists. We saw yesterday, 2 days ago, the exposure of the massive terror tunnel that Hamas had dug underneath the Gaza Strip, big enough to really move cars down it. And that had only one specific use as a means to attack Israel. There are underneath the Gaza Strip some 500 kilometers of tunnels of that nature, some larger, some smaller. The reports of the tunnels coming from Egypt into Israel are that those tunnels are even bigger and they can allow for the movement even of trucks. That's obviously how Hamas managed to get in this heavy engineering equipment that was necessary for them to dig all of the tunnels. The fighting is concentrating obviously in the north and also spreading south to Khan Yunis, and we've also seen some fighting in the Nusirat area. We haven't yet seen much fighting on the more southern areas in Rafah. The terrorists are unfortunately continuing to fire rockets. Food runs out, gas runs out. Every complaint that you would like to believe has run out. The only thing that hasn't run out for the terrorists, obviously, are their rockets, their mortars, and they keep on fighting and shooting. That's the southern area. In the north, we are continuing on with this war of attrition against the Iranian proxy in Lebanon, against Hezbollah. Hezbollah similarly keeps on firing rockets, anti-tank missiles, and other explosive devices into Israel, and Israel responding, including today, in what could be a very really broad expansion of the war if the international community doesn't step in and persuade Iran that Hezbollah is a hostile force and Israel will not tolerate the continued attacks from them, and that really the consequences for Lebanon will be catastrophic. That's something which also has to be taken into account. The general rule for both Hamas and for Hezbollah is that Israel should not be required to and should not tolerate homicidal terrorist organizations constantly undermining Israel's security and trying to murder Jews wherever they live. Far off, we've seen obviously the Houthis in Yemen continuing their actions and their aggression specifically on the open seas, interrupting the freedom of passage, interrupting the freedom of navigation. And as we reported yesterday, there is a growing coalition of already some 75 plus warships of international forces that are gathering in order to deal with that threat. Within Judea and Samaria, we're seeing continued activities against the terrorists, more and more terrorists from Hamas and the other organizations being arrested, and those activities obviously need to be seen in conjunction with the activities that are going on in the Gaza Strip. The Hamas, as a terrorist organization, doesn't have separate heads for Gaza and Judea and Samaria. The West Bank doesn't have separate military, we'll call them military terror capabilities. It's all one organization, and that has to be understood, that effective actions against Hamas to destroy Hamas and its future capabilities have to be done in tandem, not only in Gaza, but also in Judea and Samaria, and similarly with the other terrorist organizations, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and so on and so forth. And that note brings us into part of the discussion that we'll have today with advocate Anne Herzberg, to discuss really a side of the fighting that is that's really not connected to the actual fighting itself, but has direct implications on it. And really that is the role of human rights NGOs and organizations, humanitarian organizations, within the war in Gaza. We've seen, obviously, the involvement of the UN on the one side, UNRWA constantly pushing, constantly spewing the Hamas narrative, the terrorist narrative that that Israel is acting indiscriminately against the terrorists and the civilian population, that Israel is conducting all types of operations that affect and impose collective damage on the Gazan civilians. And into that we have this whole organization, this whole network of humanitarian so-called and human rights so-called NGOs that feed into that whole discussion. And thank you for joining us. Just as a heads up, I've known Anne for now many years. We worked together for a while, and so I hope that Anne, and know that Anne will be able to deal both with my questions and any questions that anyone has on the subject. Who are these organizations? Anne, tell us a little bit about these organizations. Tell us a little bit about Human Rights Watch, who has already started with its propaganda against Israel, and it's committing war crimes, and Amnesty, and on the other hand, Human Rights Watch saying, well, we want to come in and investigate the war crimes committed by Hamas. How should we look at these organizations?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Maurice. Good to be with you. Yeah, this is really the it's really another front in the war. It's the information war. And there is a network of organizations, they call themselves human rights organizations. As you mentioned, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. There's quite a large network, probably at least 50 NGOs. Many of them are getting funded by the European Union, by European governments. And what they do is they are really propaganda arms in this conflict. And it's, this is something that we've been seeing going back over 20 years. So we've been seeing the same dynamics, during the terror war of the early 2000s, the 2006 Lebanon war, plus going through all the conflicts in Gaza up until this one. And really what the primary role they play is to promote a view of international law, that it's always portraying Israel as violating international law, violating human rights, ignoring the violations committed by Hamas, by the other terror organizations. And then these reports are then fed into the media, fed into the UN. And again, it's just used to increase the demonization against Israel. It's used to stoke incitement against Israel in the international media across the globe. And so they really play a fundamental role, even though they're supposed to be promoting what's known as universal human rights. So they're supposed to be looking at this objectively using standard research methodologies. But I've been studying these groups for almost 20 years myself, and what we find is they are not acting consistently in the conflicts involving Israel that they do elsewhere. But also they are really degrading the West's ability to fight against terrorism and asymmetrical warfare. So it's really a problem. It degrades the strategic ability to fight these types of wars, I would say.
What they're really doing, if I understand correctly, and what they're really trying to do is they're really trying to redefine and almost rewrite international humanitarian law, trying to rewrite the laws of war with on all different types of front. One front being that the claim that every civilian death is a war crime, which obviously it isn't under international humanitarian law. It's obviously a tragedy when civilians are killed and when children are killed, without doubt. But it's not necessarily an infringement of the law, which these organizations, they rewrite the law and they say, well, killing a civilian is obviously a war crime. The campaign that I've seen going on recently is and coming out of Human Rights Watch is this argument that, well, a lot of the damage is caused in the Gaza city by Israel using dumb bombs and not using precision weaponry. This obviously inferring that, well, there is an obligation of some kind to use precision weaponry, which obviously there isn't. But it's that rewriting of the laws of war, which, again, they focus them on Israel, but their implications for the rest of the world are also quite widespread.
Yes, exactly. And also what they do is, as you're mentioning about these types of armaments, they project a veneer of military expertise, which they do not have. And we've seen that time and time again. We've seen that in terms of things like white phosphorus, drones, AI, a whole host of types of technologies that they paint nefariously, and they try to portray as being illegal. And then also they kind of have a facade of being, they maybe will have these reports where they're talking, make it seem like, Israel used this type of weapon to sort of create this, again, this kind of nefarious picture, when they really don't understand, how these weapons are used, why they're used. They don't understand operationally how war works. Now, I think some of it is deliberate, because I think a lot of these groups do have political agendas. That's certainly true with Amnesty, and certainly true, at least with some of the people at Human Rights Watch, that they have these political agendas they're promoting. And so they want to portray Israel always as the bad guy. And the other thing that they do when they're rewriting these laws of war is they basically act as if Hamas and Hezbollah don't exist. Everything is just written as if it's coming, almost everything they write is, what they try to do is they often will interview a couple Palestinians or Lebanese, and they invariably will say, oh, there were no fighters around. So Israel was just, for fun, targeting innocent civilians or bombing a building for fun. Like there were, they produced pictures of Israel's fighting this, invisible force. And it's quite pernicious what they're doing.
Yeah, it's without question. They completely on that level as well. They do no investigation or very little investigation at all into trying to understand both sides of the picture. What do I mean both sides of the picture? Right. On the one hand, they say, well, civilians have been killed, and that's obviously a war crime, as we mentioned before. But they never look at the other side and say, well, is it a possibility that these civilians, so-called civilians, were actually Hamas operatives, were actually Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists? And that then plays into this whole aspect of, well, these people are all civilians, and attacking them and intentionally attacking them is a war crime. So how do they get away, Anne, with really skipping over all of those stages and really presenting this picture of, according to Human Rights Watch, just for one of them, all of these organizations, Israel hasn't killed any terrorists.
Right.
I know that we know well an organization called DCI Palestine. It's a front organization for the PFLP, for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It defends children, as it were, and it's all nice and fluffy. But really, when you look at the charts of children killed, it says 0 children were ever killed while they were involved in terrorism. None, 0. So if a child went up and stabbed a Jew in the back and was then shot in self-defense, well, that wasn't terrorism. This is the portrayal that is given over. How do these organizations justify and explain how they skip those steps, how no terrorists even exist?
Yeah, also, just before I get into why or how they get away with it, another thing that they do is they place Israel, the IDF, but they also do this with, the United States Army. They place them on equal footing with these terrorist organizations. And anyone who knows anything, who is a serious, someone who's engaged in these issues seriously, serious academics, serious researchers, know that the Israeli military, it doesn't always act, obviously, it's not 100% perfect. And there are obviously mistakes, and there sometimes need to be policy adjustments. But anyone who is serious knows that the IDF invests considerable resources into ensuring compliance with the laws of war. They have lawyers embedded, I believe, down to the battalion level, maybe even smaller units. You probably have a better idea about that. And in terms of reviewing strikes, so they take extensive measures to try and comply with the law. Again, it's not always perfect, but they're always at least striving for that objective. In contrast, we have these terrorist organizations, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, ISIS, that by policy, by their being, do not follow the law at all. They have no interest in following the law. They are, they just are about promoting brutality and killing, and have no interest in any way in observing human rights or complying with international agreements. And what these human rights groups do is they're placing the two sides on equal footing, which is ridiculous. So that's something else that they're doing that's really degrading how wars are fought and won, makes it very difficult to win wars because of that. Now, how they get away with it is, unfortunately, certainly in Israel's case, but I think we're seeing that, definitely since 9/11, but even before that, it was, in the Cold War, even this was happening, where politically, there a lot of these groups have this agenda where they are hostile to the West, and they are definitely hostile to Israel. And unfortunately, there's a growing phenomenon in the media where that's the case. So these groups, the work of these groups, they're very receptive to these groups. At the UN, certainly we have that hostility. So they adopt a lot of these reports without question. A lot of them have worked. There's something like a revolving door between NGOs and the UN. So a lot of them have worked at these NGOs. So there's not a lot of critical analysis. And I think the other thing is, maybe to the general public, because these groups are dealing with human rights or humanitarian issues, they have something that we call an NGO Monitor, the halo effect. So people think, oh, because they're doing human rights, they're always, doing good, or they're altruistic, or they don't have any hidden agendas. And so therefore, they don't really look critically at what these groups are saying. They just sort of take it at face value. And a lot of the issues are quite complicated, and particularly when we're dealing with international law, international humanitarian law, where it's extremely complex, and most people aren't familiar with the rules, it's quite easy for these groups to step in and exploit the ignorance of people. And because they speak in that language, it sounds good. And if you're not familiar with the rules, you wouldn't necessarily know that what they're saying isn't accurate.
What's unbelievable is that you see these distortions really coming out, and they get a lot of credibility, as you say, because they have that halo effect. You assume that they're people who present themselves as lawyers and as human rights lawyers, and are doing all this work for the better part of humanity, then present arguments which are outrageous. I can give you one that's really running around today. I won't tell you. You can try and maybe guess who the genius who wrote this on is. We know him personally, obviously. So this genius says like this: in every other war in the world, you have the ability, and refugees are created. Refugees run away from the war, and that is considered to be a legitimate consequence of the war. We saw, for example, from the Ukraine, there are some 6 million refugees that left the Ukraine that are spread around the world. We had about 4.5 million refugees out of Syria, and no one claims in those circumstances that the act being carried out when these refugees run away from the war is an act of forced displacement of the population. Now, in our case, we have a situation where Egypt on Gaza's southern border, a few days into the war, decided we're not going to allow any refugees to run away. No Gazans will be allowed to run for their lives, the innocent Gazans, and seek refuge in the Sinai. They even placed a row of tanks. I kid you not. There's pictures of Egyptian tanks facing the Gaza Strip to ensure that none of the innocent Gazans come out. Now, this gentleman has decided to so distort international law that he's now threatening the Egyptians that if you allow these refugees to run away, run for their lives, run away from the war zones, run away from the terrorists that are running the Gaza Strip, you, Egypt, will be complicit in war crimes. How would you respond to an argument like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And it really, in the case of Israel, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because of course, had Israel not taken steps to, let's say, northern Gaza, evacuate people to southern Gaza or create the corridors so that people could leave, and let's say they went ahead with the campaign before these people had left, all of these groups would have been screaming war crimes, you're attacking civilians deliberately. So you can't win, and then if they make the corridor, oh, you're forcibly displacing. So it doesn't matter what Israel does. These groups are always going to say what it's doing is wrong, and they never provide any realistic alternatives. Now, the other thing is, especially in the case with the displacement, if you look at not only in Ukraine, also with the fight against ISIS, you had these groups, these human rights groups, but also we have to add in there now the humanitarian organizations that were helping people evacuate to safer zones, to safe zones in Mosul, in Fallujah. Norwegian Refugee Council, Médecins Sans Frontières, all of these groups were, calling on the international community to help them evacuate the people. And then when it comes to Israel, oh no, you're committing a war crime by helping the people evacuate. So again, it just sort of shows the double standards that are at play with these organizations. And I think the other thing that I have been finding so, enraging, I mean, there's really no other word for it, is for 15 years, these groups have been well aware of Hamas embedding thoroughly within the civilian infrastructure in Gaza. They've said nothing. In some cases, they may have even been complicit. Some of the NGOs that operate, let's say, El Shifa Hospital, I don't think it was it wasn't a secret that Hamas was openly operating within that hospital, and there are many humanitarian NGOs operating in that hospital. So I think we have some big issues of complicity there. And now all of a sudden, when it's come to a head, they're getting increasingly hysterical and egregious in their reporting on the conflict. And I will add, the northern border, the same dynamic is going on in Lebanon. So since 2006, there's been 200,000 rockets and God knows what other weaponry that's been embedded there. And these groups know it and they're saying nothing. But of course, again, we're going to see this disproportionate response by the NGOs and all these hysterical and false claims when the conflict heats up even more than it has been, and so shame on them, because if this really was a problem for them, why have they been not shouting to the hills, condemning Hamas, condemning Hezbollah, condemning the international community for allowing the co-location to take place?
And really, the question is more refined. Why are they not calling out these terrorist organizations, and they're internationally designated terrorist organizations that are acting with NGO humanitarian rights impunity? Both against the Gazan population and against Israel. So on that note, and really, it's impossible to really have argued that no one knew what was going on in Gaza, that no one saw the missiles coming in, that no one saw the missiles being embedded in every school, hospital, playground, and no one could really have argued that they didn't see these hundreds of kilometers of tunnels being built. Did you ever see a report of any of these organizations discussing those issues, calling out specifically saying this is a red flag? Hamas in Gaza is arming itself to the T. Hamas is using the civilian population as both human shields and embedding itself within the civilian infrastructure. How many times have you seen that in the last 20 years?
Very rare. You might have a token statement here or there. Once Amnesty admitted that there was torture happening at Al-Shifa Hospital after the 2014 conflict, but they talked about it once. You never heard about it again. You don't hear about it. You know, I go to the UN a lot, at the Human Rights Council, and these NGOs all speak. They never talk about it. I was at one meeting with NGOs at the UN, and they gave a whole presentation. This was in 2015. They gave a whole presentation about, you know, how Israel was attacking hospitals. And I said, you know, I'm finding this quite interesting, this whole hour-long discussion, and you haven't once mentioned that Hamas embeds within the hospitals. And basically the response was they tried to get me kicked out of the meeting and also kicked out of the UN for daring to ask a question like that in this meeting. So, you know, it's cover-up. It's really been a 15-year cover-up. In some cases, you know, it wouldn't surprise me if some of the NGOs are actively involved in helping the cover-up. We saw that in the case of World Vision, where, you know, their head, I think it was the head of their operations in Gaza, diverted millions and millions of dollars to Hamas and was convicted for it last year. And the response of the NGOs has been denial or lying. You know, they're either naive, the international offices are either naive or completely lying, and denial about it. So it's a huge problem. And I think, you know, after October 7th and what's been going on, you know, if these groups think it's going to go back to business as usual, no.
So I hope so, because I mean, what we've really seen, the two incidents in the last few years that really highlighted the problematic nature of the actions of the NGOs, the absence of any type of critical thinking, any type of oversight. Even in the case of Mohammed Khalabi, the Hamas terrorist who embedded himself within World Vision, and then, according to the indictment and his conviction, diverted tens of millions of shekels and even dollars towards Hamas activities on the one hand, and then you've seen this other the more recent discovery of the PFLP network of terrorist organizations, the PFLP front organizations that gathered money from all types of organizations, even governments around the world, and then funneled that money, amongst other things, to the terrorist activities. Specifically, there we're talking about the Health Workers Committee run by Walid Khanache, and the other PFLP organizations that were then involved in carrying out the terror attack in which Irina Schnurb was murdered in 2019. And you see that as part of that investigation, the senior figures even admitted to writing and sending fictitious invoices in order to receive more and more funds. And no one really looked, no one really cared until it was too late, until Jews were murdered. And even thereafter, when Israel's Minister of Defense declared these organizations as terrorist organizations, they even carried on pushing back. To what extent have you seen a reduction in, at least in the policy sense of the word and policy statements, of the funding that's coming for these organizations from the European governments, from these major funds. We saw Switzerland recently adopting a decision, if I'm not mistaken, to cut funding to certain organizations. What's going on with that? Are these European governments accepting the fact that these are front organizations? Are they continuing to fund them? And if so, to what extent?
Yeah, now before I answer that, I'll add that, because we have this network of NGOs and they're quite influential, they partner a lot with bigger international NGOs. So you'll see Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, FIDH, many of these other bigger international NGOs partnering, relying on the local PFLP NGOs, and they really run interference for them. So when the PFLP connections were exposed and these groups were designated, these international groups really ran interference for them. But part of the reason that we don't see a lot of coverage about Hamas embedding in Gaza, and we don't see, reports about child soldiers, and the UN can't, for some reason, ever investigate the recruitment and use of children as child soldiers because it just can't gather the information, even though it's got this human rights working group to do so. But when it turns out that many of the groups in their working group are affiliated with the PFLP, then it starts to make sense because they're not reporting on it because they don't want to report on themselves, essentially. And even one of the hospitals, the Al-Ada hospital in Gaza, is a PFLP hospital. So, of course, we're not going to hear about that from any of these organizations. Now, I think, after October 7th, when many of these groups, the statements they made were just outrageous, justifying the attacks, calling it, acceptable resistance, justified resistance, not reporting on they're supposed to be human rights groups, but they're not reporting on the human rights violations committed by Palestinians against Israelis, and making all other, types of egregious claims. It did seem to wake up some of the funders. So as you mentioned, Switzerland cut off money to some of the groups, but not all. Like there's still some groups that for some reason these governments just can't stop funding. I don't understand it, particularly when the evidence is very clear. Also in the EU, we have the same thing where they're supposedly looking. They, I believe, cut off 2 NGOs. But the problem is, because they have this international network behind them, they have extremely strong lobby. So whenever any governments try to engage in oversight, these groups basically, just activate their lobbying network, and so much pressure is put on the governments that it's very hard to get the money frozen or canceled, and oftentimes it gets reinstated. So we'll have to see. I mean, I don't see how you can look at what they're particularly, even up until this point, these people should never have been getting millions of dollars from European taxpayers. But now, after October 7th and the things that they've done, it should be a no-brainer. It's just, there's no way these groups should be getting such money. But we'll see what happens.
But these groups have
I don't understand the addiction, frankly, to giving these people money. They have no measured results from their work. They've done nothing to promote peace, to resolve the conflict. If anything, they've made it much worse. So honestly, I also do not understand, why this money continues to be pumped into these organizations.
Talk to us a little bit, Anne, about that, about really the synergy. I mean, you've already mentioned it and touched on it partially. The synergy between the NGOs that are specifically anti-Israel and the whole UN mechanism, whether it be UNRWA, whether it be UNICEF, whether it be OCHA, where you see it's really one feeds automatically into the other to feed the other, and then it comes out as resolutions and almost something which is that inevitable? How can that in any way be stopped, brought to a halt, even temporarily?
Yeah, it's very difficult. So just to give an example of like one of the campaigns that you and I actually worked on quite extensively, where the UN has this Children in Armed Conflict program. And based on a Security Council resolution, they have a list of countries that they claim or entities that are violating the rights of children in war, and there's criteria for that. And right now, the list includes groups like ISIS, the Taliban, Al Qaeda, but this network of NGOs working with UNICEF has been trying to get the IDF on this list for years. And they have yet to be successful, but they basically pump out, dozens of reports each year, lobbying UN officials to try to get the IDF on the list. And, so in some cases, you can have political pressure to stop these campaigns, depending on who the actor is of the UN. But when you're dealing, let's say, with the Human Rights Council mechanisms that are in Geneva, it's extremely difficult because those mechanisms are run by dictatorships. And so it's almost basically it's impossible to get a vote at the UN that is favorable to Israel because of the way the countries are, it's always going to be like 130 countries to about 60 countries. That's sort of the breakdown with the authoritarian governments versus the democratic governments. So you can never really win a vote. So it's very easy for these countries to pretty much pass whatever they want at the UN. So that feeds into all of these anti-Israel mechanisms. And then because the UN doesn't have the ability, they have very small staffs to carry out the work that is called for in these mechanisms, they rely on NGOs. And often the people hired at the UN have these anti-Israel priors. So they're always going to turn to anti-Israel NGOs for their information. And you and I both know, even when suggested that they try to meet with people who don't share those views, they refuse to meet with you. So that's definitely part of the problem. And also the other problem is there's no enforcement mechanisms in the UN. So, for instance, the Special Rapporteur for the Palestinians or the Commission of Inquiry, the Permanent Commission of Inquiry on Israel right now, which has 3 noted anti-Semites. They've all made terrible anti-Semitic comments. In their last report to the General Assembly in October, the word terrorism and terrorists appeared in scare quotes. They don't think terrorism even exists. They don't think Gaza poses a security threat. And this was presented after October 7th. I mean, it just shows who these people are. They had hearings last year where they invited the PFL NGOs, calling them human rights defenders, whitewashing them as human rights defenders. And there's no enforcement mechanism. There's no way to complain. There's no way to hold them accountable. Really the only thing you could do is try to get Western governments to cut the money off. But unfortunately, a lot of countries are just very reluctant to do that. Again, I don't understand why, because I don't really see the value add for almost any of these mechanisms regarding any country. I think they have not demonstrated proven results on really anything. So it's basically just a waste of money. But for some reason, again, they just keep these institutions going. I think it's incumbent upon parliamentarians and taxpayers to try to hold them accountable, because really the funding is the only way to do so.
And as Abba Eban, you mentioned about the UN, as Abba Eban famously equipped, if Algeria were to introduce a resolution declaring that the earth was flat and that Israel had flattened it, it would pass by a vote of 164 to 13 with 26 abstentions.
Exactly.
I think that pretty much sums up the UN, definitely the UN General Assembly. What is Israel doing, Anne? What is Israel doing? We can't only blame others. We have to look at ourselves and our own activities. I saw a report from the Palestinian Authority, actually, in which it was claimed that Israel had that one of these central UN characters, someone who's been particularly hostile to Israel, Lynn Hastings, was not going to be expelled from Israel, as I had previously recommended, but that Israel had decided to not extend her work visa. which effectively means that she's going to have to leave. Excuse me. What is Israel doing on that front? We know that this UN mechanism is vile and particularly anti-Israel, and it spreads across the world and it spreads this information. What, on the one hand, and on the other hand, also with these so-called human rights organizations. I saw recently a report that a group of investigators from Human Rights Watch had come into Israel to investigate in inverted commas the war crimes committed on October 7th and in Gaza since the start of the war. How can Israel prevent this from going on? What can we do about the UN? What can we do about these so-called human rights organizations?
Yeah, it's very complicated. In terms of the Human Rights Watch trip, my guess is they lied when they came in. They just came in under tourist visas. That's something. So it's hard in those cases to kind of prevent that type of activity, because if you have a passport from the right countries, it's easy to get in, and then you can do something like that. But certainly I don't think Israel, the official channel, should be engaging with groups like that. Any group that's not engaging in credible research doesn't deserve the privilege of meeting with the Israeli government. They should not be entertaining these people who are acting in bad faith. And I think they've been doing the right thing by not engaging, let's say, with the Human Rights Council rapporteur for the Palestinians or for the Commission of Inquiry. So I think they are correct in those decisions. They should not be engaging with agencies or individuals that are clearly showing that they have no interest in carrying out their work in accordance with fair procedures. So that should be a given. I think the government, though, really does also need to do a better job about putting out information to counter a lot of these claims. It's very hard for us, also, I'm sure in your work, to obtain the information we need to counter claims. So that's something that I've been advocating the government to do for a long time. To put out substantive responses to these reports, so that we have the material which we can show that what's going on is what these groups are saying is false. Now, I think during this conflict, the IDF's been doing a pretty good job about that, much better than it has in previous conflicts. And particularly in the environment they're working in, I think they're doing a very it's you can't be expected to put out intelligence or information that might be harmful to the military effort, but they've been doing a very good job, and the current spokespeople are doing a very good job. But there's a whole host of other issues in other areas where they could be countering that, because I think that's one area. I think once people are aware of the facts, then, like Human Rights Watch had this ridiculous report, I believe it came out yesterday, claiming Israel had a policy to starve the Gazans, which was just completely absurd. It wasn't on the Israeli end. The humanitarian aid trucks were being held up, and Hamas, there's copious video of Hamas stealing all the aid trucks coming into to the strip. So, and that's not even talked about by Human Rights Watch. So, that kind of thing, when the information's out there, then makes it very easy to challenge what they're saying.
I think it's partly understanding that Israel's war with the terrorists doesn't end on the battlefield itself, but continues on to this war of information, both globally to educate people as to what's actually going on the ground, just the basic facts, and thereafter also the legal analysis, which really does influence a lot of people's hearts and minds, even before it gets to the additional levels, when we'll see all types of legal claims being made, demands for legal action to be taken in the ICC and all types of international forums, which I'm sure we will no doubt see. But as you so quietly quite rightly mentioned that probably one of the most immediate threats that Israel faces at the moment is this whole idea of this reporting mechanism based on children in armed conflict. Hamas has done an excellent job at promoting its propaganda about the number of children being killed in the fighting, and really no one having any ability to look at it critically and say, well, who are these people? Are these people even dead? Do we know who they were in the first place? Where are the bodies? And so on and so forth. That's a subject which obviously is going to go on for a long time, but immediately feeding into the decision of the UN Secretary General, which is generally in June, July of the following year, as to whether to include one organization or another on the blacklist. And since we've already seen Guterres's response to the massacre, saying that it didn't happen in a vacuum, I would say that we possibly have a lot to fear there. A closing comment in a minute, if I may, Anne.
Sure.
Just where do we go from here? A minute until we need to finish.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's critical from our side is to start documenting all of these egregious behaviors, particularly with the humanitarian NGOs and the UN agencies, and how they have covered up or actively complicit in Hamas's embedding in Gaza, also Lebanon, but right now we can deal with Gaza, and start holding these people accountable. You know, the former representative to the EU in July, as his parting act, in his position, did a paraglide ride in Gaza and flew off of cliffs in the paraglider, screaming "Free, free Palestine." And according to an article about that incident, said that under the cover of EU diplomatic community, they brought in paragliders into Gaza. And even though Israel had that on a list of banned potential dual use items, and as we saw, they were used to kill people at the Nova Music Festival. And so that diplomat should be first on the list for investigation for complicity in war crimes. Did he help Hamas smuggle paragliders into Gaza? Did they know what these paragliders were going to be used for? And same thing, Al-Shifa Hospital. We saw that horrible video where the hostages on October 7th were brought into Al-Shifa Hospital. And you see many hospital staff mulling around. So as of the morning of October 7th, they knew there were hostages in that hospital. Were any of those people with ICRC, MSF? Did they know the hostages were there and they didn't say anything? So I think this is the type of stuff. This is how we fight back. We need to start documenting these crimes, holding these people accountable. If not trials in Israel, a universal jurisdiction trial in Europe and in America. I don't have much hope the ICC, would hold any of them accountable. But this is what we have to do. We can do this too. We're often just playing defense on a lot of these issues, and we also can go on the offensive. We need to hold these people to the fire. How much of their, it's not just World Vision. How many other of these NGOs, knew their money was being stolen by Hamas? And they didn't say anything,
Yep.
and we just can't look away anymore. So that's, I think, where we should be directing our energies going forward.
Thank you, Anne, for that, and also to Robert Seedy for asking the question specifically on the subject of the paragliders, and bringing that into the picture as well. The ICC and everything else going on there is obviously another entire session that we have to hold as to what's going on there, the advantages, disadvantages. But that will have to be for another day. Our time has run out for today. So for now, Anne, thank you for joining us, and thank you to our viewers for joining us again. We will be back with you again tomorrow at 4 o'clock Israel time from Jerusalem. Please stay safe, and